Quilt-as-you-go with pointy patchwork blocks? Let's do it. In this episode, I'm going to show how to join pointy patchwork blocks together quilt-as-you-go. A pointy block is any block that has points that finish 1/4 inch from the edge, which can be a problem if your block is not made accurately to begin with. That's why in part 2/1, we took the time to make a 45-minute tutorial whilst making 2 traditional blocks, the Churn dash and Ohio star. We discussed the scant 1/4 inch seam, the pressing technique, and the pin trick to ensure that your seams align. If you'd like to know more about Island Home, the fabrics and behind the scenes, check out our Island Home journal on our website. We will be adding entries as we make this quilt. Welcome back to Monica Poole TV. I'm Monica Poole and I specialise in quilt-as-you-go quilts. So my daughter and I make lots of videos about how to quilt as you go. We have a lot of videos already on YouTube showing different methods, and the method I'm going to show you today I've actually shown before, but I used applique blocks. So quilt-as-you-go on applique is quite easy because you don't have to worry about being accurate with your points if you're using a patchwork block or lining up those seams. So in today's video I'm going to show how to join pointy blocks together quilt-as-you-go.
If you would like to make the Island Home quilt, or you would like written instructions for any of our Island Home episodes, you can purchase and download the Island Home course notes from our website. Head to patternpool.com for more information.
Your finished block should measure 12.5 inches square. If they're slightly smaller, that's okay, just as long as they're both the same size. To check, you could use a 12.5 inch square ruler, or mark a 12.5 inch square on your cutting mat with masking tape. There really is not much room for trimming, but you could neaten up the block if there are any frayed edges. As I said, just so long as they are the same size, and if they are a little bit smaller, don't stress because we will be adding some borders around the edge to bring them up to the correct size as we go along in the quilt course. Cut your batting and backing 1 inch bigger than the blocks so that when you layer them together, you'll have a 1/2 inch gap all the way around the edge. Hold together with safety pins. 1 safety pin in each square is enough to hold the layers together. Now with this method, you need to stop the quilting 2 inches away from the edge that will be joined onto another edge. So to remind myself, I'm going to add some extra pins like this, just across the seam, so I'll remember to stop 2 inches away from the edge. To anchor the layers together, we're going to stitch in the ditch. At the machine, I'm using a thread that's the same colour as my background fabric, a size 80 quilting needle, and I'll have my walking foot attached with a stitch length of 3. When you stitch in the ditch, you're stitching on the low side of the seam. So it's the opposite side to the way that the seam was pressed. In the pinwheel block, I discussed stopping and starting with 6 or 7 small stitches. So whenever I start and stop, I want to do that in the seam allowance. And so my starting and ending tie off, or whether you're doing the small stitches, is always going to be in the seam allowance. That way, when we join our pieces together, it's never going to be visible on the actual backing of your quilt. You won't be able to see it. So first of all, I'm just going to stitch in the ditch of my seams going down. I'm then going to spin the block, stitch in the ditch of my seams going down this way. And I've got my pins here to remind me to stop sewing 2 inches, or that'll be about 2 1/4 inches away from the edge. And remember, stitching in the ditch is where we pull the seam apart and we ease towards the foot. So at this stage, it's a good idea to flip your work over to the back, double check that your tension is nice and everything is going well. So let's keep going. So let's stitch in the ditch of all of the seams, but stopping at my pins, which is 2 or 2 1/4 inches away from the edge. And I'm going to do the same to my other block too. Okay, so I've stitched in the ditch of every seam like this, and then I've come back and I've stitched in the ditch of all of these seams, our rectangle seams, and then I've stitched in the ditch of all of our diagonal seams. Now on this side here, I made sure that I've stopped level with this seam here. So I've stitched along here and I've stopped and I've tied off. So that's because I can now actually take all the pins out, and this, as I said, the ditch stitching is just to anchor it. And here, my layers are going to be free on this edge, whereas along here, all edges are stitched. So now I'm going to stitch in the ditch of every seam on my star block, and I'm just going to make sure that I stop stitching about 2 inches away from the edge, just in the same way that I did with the Churn dash block. So when you stitch across a seam, you're going to be stitching on this side here. I'm stitching on the blue, and then when I get to here, because my seam's going in the opposite direction, I'm going to kind of cross the seam and stitch on the green. So the idea of stitching in the ditch and getting right into that ditch is that your thread color won't actually be seen. So even though I'm stitching on the green, I'm still using the cream thread. Now some people like to use a monofilament thread for this, but I'm just happy working with my cream thread. And if you don't get right in the ditch, don't worry too much about that. I mean, it's quilting, we're using threads, and if you can see it, it really doesn't matter. When you sew the star points, so from outside corner to another outside corner, and then start here and come across, we're actually going to stop level here, and then you will actually just be able to go straight onto this corner here and then back from here to here. Don't stress if you can't remember, because that will all be in the course notes. See those pinholes? Just scratch those with your nail and that will close them up. So I've stitched in the ditch and removed the pins, and now we're going to do some extra quilting, but we're going to make sure that we leave these two edges free, because that's how we're going to join these two blocks together. So last week we touched on echo quilting, and this week we're going to show some continuous straight line quilting that's really effective, and anybody can do this with their walking foot attached. So you can see I've already started quilting on this block here, and I've just started up the top here, and I have just worked my way around till I get to the center. Now you can use your walking foot and the edge of your walking foot on the edge of the fabric just to give you a guide for your spacing. I'm actually going to be using my walking foot with a 1/4 inch guide. Everybody is going to end up with their own kind of look when it comes to this kind of quilting. I like to keep mine really organic looking because I know every time I try to make things straight and perfect, well, I have to make the excuse that it's organic anyway, so I'm just going to start off organic. So I'm now going to demonstrate how to do this in the center of the Churn dash block. So with your machine set up in the same way, start sewing level with the seam, and I have my guide in the seam, or if you are using a walking foot, your walking foot would be on the edge of the seam. You can start and finish your quilting with an automatic tie-off like I previously mentioned, or you can do the small stitches like I showed in last week's video, or leave your threads long because some people like to thread them back into their quilt to keep them nice and secure. It's totally up to you. So first of all, I'm just going to work around the square, just like this. You kind of have to guess, or I can actually look at those little marks on my foot there to see if I'm 1/4 of an inch away. Then I'm going to stop with the needle in the down position and pivot onto the next edge. Same thing again. Sometimes you're kind of guessing where to turn. And if you turn and it's okay, that's good. Sometimes you might have to do an extra stitch. And now this time I'm going to stop 1/4 of an inch away from my stitching line. And I'm just going to keep working around the square in exactly the same way. So you're basically stopping with your needle in the down position, lifting the foot and then turning. And if you have that pivot function, you can set that on your machine and it makes it so much easier. So I've got to a point where I feel that I can't go anymore, so I'm just going to sew up to the stitching line and finish off my quilting there. And there we are. Quite organic, I would say. So I'm now going to show how to stitch an outside rectangle, and I just wanted to note that this is my edge here where I haven't stitched in the ditch all the way to the edge, and I've marked that with some safety pins so that I don't accidentally stitch on that side of the block there. So to sew the rectangles, mark a line that is 1/2 inch away from the edge of the fabric, and I'm just going to mark down like this. Use a fabric marker that can easily be erased from the fabric. I'm using my Sew Line grey pencil, and I've stopped my mark at that 1/4 inch away from the edge of the seam mark there. So that's my starting point. So all I have to do now is I started at the seam, sew all the way down to 1/4 inch away from this seam here, and then just keep working my way and spiraling into the center. Looks really good, doesn't it?
Yeah, I like it.
Really cool. And this is how we quilt the corners, and I've got a little bit of a tip for you. So that the corners Don't accidentally flip back like that when you are quilting. Just use a little bit of fabric glue just in the corner like that. Smooth that in place, and then a couple of dabs in the corner on the top. That's going to hold all of that together. And now we're going to mark our lines that are spaced 1/2 inch away from the edge. With this one here, I'll actually stop at the 1/4 inch away from the edge, so I've got a little bit of a guide on where to stop. So we're going to start here, sew to here, and continue our lines spiraling in. So that's all the quilting that I'm going to do on the Churn dash block, and I'm going to leave all of this edge here free because once I join them together, I'll come back and do some extra quilting.
Yeah, that quilting looked really fun.
It really is fun actually, it's quite therapeutic. And now to finish the quilting on the star block. So to quilt these corners, what I did was I just marked a line from my point to point, and then I was able to just start sewing here, stopping about a 1/4 inch away. You can see it's not exactly a 1/4 inch. And then I kept just working my way in to there. And now to stitch on this side of the triangle, I'll do the same thing, mark that line 1/2 inch away from the edge. And just to explain the reason why we're doing this line here is because when we join these blocks, we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam, and you'll just have that little bit of space between the stitching lines and the seam. And marking my line here, and finishing it that 1/4 inch away from the edge. And don't forget that little glue trick. And one more little tip, when you're sewing on the edge, if you feel that the edge is getting wavy, just use a tailor's awl or a big pin or your unpicker to push the fabric or ease the fabric towards the foot. And here's my corner. And now to quilt a side corner, that's just a matter of marking our line 1/2 inch away from the edge. And I think we all know what's going to happen now. We're going to start at the seam, start working from the outside edge, 1/4 inch away from the seam, and spiraling our way into the center. So have fun with it. And there's my star block. I've finished the quilting, and you can see that there's no quilting here or here, and that's because there are edges that are going to join together. So make sure you use those pins to mark those edges, because otherwise, if you do what I did and go ahead and stitch that, there's a lot of unpicking to do. And now to join our blocks together, the first step is to trim. So just before we start trimming, I just want to mention that every time you quilt something, it always shrinks in a little bit. So our blocks were square to begin with, and I'm not going to try and square them up just now because we've got a lot of extra quilting on this side, whereas these edges that are going to go together are a little bit looser. So first of all, what we're going to do is we're just going to trim a 1/4 inch away from our top fabric, trimming away the excess batting and batting, and we'll just do that all the way around the edge to begin with. So just resting the 1/4 inch line of your ruler on the edge of the top fabric. So now it's time to join the blocks together. So place them right sides together on the quilt-free edges like that. Separate the batting and backing so that you can easily pin the top layers together. Now we're going to pin these corners with the pin trick that I showed in last week's video. So that is where we want our pin to be 1/4 inch away from the edge into our stitching line of the seam. Then we're going to take it into the actual point on the other side of the block. Then we'll squeeze it together and then we'll come down into the stitching line and back up into this stitching line here. And our seams, we thought ahead and we made sure that our seams were going to go in opposite ways so that they're nesting together like that. And now let's pin the other seam. Now pin the outer edges and then pop some extra pins in between. Just like that. So let's sew that seam with the scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, just in the same way that I showed you in the last tutorial. And you can pin the batting and backing out of the way if you like. For me, I find it's not going to be an issue because it's just a small section. I'm starting with my leader and I'm going to do a little reverse stitch at the beginning and sewing the seam. Very carefully working towards our seam with the points and sliding the pin out just before you get to the pin. And reverse stitch at the end. Okay, so let's check the points. Not too bad, quite happy with that. Okay, so I'm actually going to press the seam to one side. So I just give that a finger crease on the wrong side and then I'm going to flip it to the right side and give that a press with a nice clean iron. So I'm going to flip my work over to the wrong side and I'm going to lay one side of the batting flat. Now, if my seam's going this way, my batting is going to go in the opposite way and lay over the seam like that. Now with this side of the batting, you're going to find that it's too big. So with them overlapped, you can kind of see a shadow underneath and you can just make a few marks there where the batting will meet. But if you were to measure that, it would actually measure 1 inch. And I'm pretty sure that that's 1 inch. So I'm actually going to trim off one side of the batting, so this side here, and I'm going to trim 1 inch off that. Now, make sure that there's nothing underneath. Double check 3 times, triple check. Because the last thing you want to do is cut into your quilt. And just before I trim, I'm going to check again. So that's good. And I'm trimming that 1 inch off, just the one side. What this does is it staggers the join. So rather than everything joining in the one place, we have our seam here and then we have our batting joining here. And so they now should just be butting up together like that. So I'm back at the ironing board and we're now going to join the batting using batting joining tape. Now you can just hand stitch the batting together if you like. It's just a couple of loose hand stitches going from side to side. make sure they're not too tight because you'll pull that in and you'll make the top of your quilt puffy. So just nice loose hand stitches. But I'm going to use batting joining tape. So batting joining tape is completely different to any fusible web tape. What it is, it's a thin nylon tape. On one side it's rough, that side has the glue, and on the other side it's smooth. And all that's going to do is just hold my two edges of batting together. So to show you how to use it, take the rough side, position the rough side across the join like that. Cut a piece so that it's the same length as your work. Now with the nylon tape, if you hit that with a hot iron, it's going to shrivel, so you need to cover that, and I'm just going to cover that with my backing fabric. So I'm going to lay one side flat and I'm going to lay the other side over, so that's protecting my nylon tape, and now I can just give that a really good press with the iron. You don't have to use the batting joining tape. As I said, you can just hand sew that if you like. And as I mentioned, it's completely different to any kind of fusible web tape because it's not double-sided with the fusing. It's just a single side layer of fusing that holds our edges of the batting together. So when I open out now, you'll be able to see that my two edges of the batting are joined together and it's nice and secure using the batting joining tape. Now to close up the backing fabric, I'm going to lay one side flat, so the side that has the batting trimmed. So if I lay that over like that, once again I'm staggering that join. And now I'm going to bring this side over and I'm just going to fold that under. So I'm going to fold that under by 3/8 of an inch, and it's a really good idea if you mark that. First of all, I know it's hard for you to see, but there's my edge there. And I'm going to mark 3/8 of an inch away from the edge. You can hand stitch this if you want to. And now on this side, I'll just come along with my little iron and press over on my folded edge. Make sure you're making this as straight and neat as possible. So I'm back at the cutting mat. I have one side of my backing fabric sitting nice and flat, and then I have my folded edge of the backing fabric, and that's going to come over like that. So just to keep that in place, I'm just going to run a little bit of my fabric glue just along the raw seam, just like that. And then I'll smooth this over, making sure it's all nice and straight. I think I already mentioned you can hand sew this if you want to, but I'm going to stitch in the ditch. So I'm going to flip it over to the front. Using some nice sharp pins, I'm just going to pin in the ditch like that.
Do you have any pinning tricks?
Use good quality pins, so a nice pin that easily goes into the fabric and slides into the fabric is so much better than using what my mum would call a crowbar. Just thick, blunt pins, my mum would say, oh, that's like a crowbar. Good old grandma. So when you flip it over to the back, you can see that we're just catching in that folded edge. And now let's stitch in the ditch. You can use either your walking foot or an open toe foot. And just put your stitch length back up to 3. So bring your needle right down into the seam. You can start and finish with a little reverse stitch right on the very edge of the block and remove your pins as you sew. The idea is to get right in that ditch so it won't be seen. So I'm getting a little bit of a bubble here, so I'm just going to use my tailor's awl just to ease the fabric towards the foot. finishing with a little reverse stitch right on the very edge. And I've just caught the folded edge of the backing fabric in, and I'm happy with that. So now I have joined those two edges together, I can now finish off the quilting. So I'm now just going to quilt these sections in exactly the same way that I did all of these sections here. So what did you think of that method?
I'm not gonna lie, I did think it looked really hard at first.
Yep.
And when I was filming you stitching in the ditch, I did get really nervous for when you're gonna turn it over. But then I realized if your gluing and pinning is right, trust the process, and all you have to do is stitch in a straight line, and it's actually not that hard.
No, it's not that hard at all.
No, not at all.
No.
So where would you use this method in other quilts?
So you would use this method if you didn't want any sashing or interruption between your blocks, and you can pretty much use it anywhere. You've just got to make sure that the edges that you want to join together you leave free of quilting. And if anyone wants more information on this method, we'll have the course notes available to purchase on our website, and I'll really take a deep dive into where you would actually use this method.
Oh, sounds good.
Quilt-as-you-go. Oh, sorry. So in the last video, fly. So I tried to go a little bit fancy with the quilting and I don't like it. So I'm actually gonna have to unpick the whole lot. Oh, okay. I thought you were asking me a question. All right. This row's nice and open so that you can easily get into it.
Hey.
Oh, we've got a visitor.
We'll see you next time.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.